Bill, we always hear that God is the creator. Okay, sounds simple. But what is the creation? What is a world? It's not so simple as people think.
Well, I think the doctrine of creation means that God is the source of all reality outside himself, that apart from God, everything else has been brought into being by God.
Now, what is everything else?
Well, it would include all reality, whatever realms of reality you might think it exists. It would be all physical, concrete objects. It would be time and space themselves. It would be any realms of spiritual reality that you might believe exist, such as angels and other spiritual beings. And it would include any sort of abstract objects, if you think that those sorts of things exist.
Like mathematics, 2 plus 2
like
equals 4. Or
sets and numbers and propositions and so forth. Anything that exists that is not God himself has been brought into being by God.
How about things like causation or logic, operations among ideas?
I would see things like logic as grounded in the very mind of God himself. The Gospel of John refers to God as the Logos, from which we get our word logic. It means reason or word. And it presents God as the creator of all things. It says that in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, the Logos was God. All things were brought into being through him, and without him nothing came into being. So the idea there is that God is the supremely logical agent, and logic, as we use it, is simply a reflection of the mind of God himself.
So everything outside of God himself, God is responsible for, and this is a vast number of things, anything that we can conceive of and anything we can't conceive of.
Well, anything that exists. I mean, there are, in a sense, fictional entities. For example, Sherlock Holmes. I don't think Sherlock Holmes exists. That's a fictional character. So God doesn't bring Sherlock Holmes into being unless you think that Sherlock Holmes is some sort of abstract object, as some philosophers do. So everything that exists owes its being to God, and I would say was brought into being by God at a specific time, which implies that the creation or the world or reality outside of God has not always existed. I think that most people don't understand that the idea of creation is inherently bound up with temporal considerations. These things are not just dependent upon God for their being, but they were brought into being by God.
Now, you've distinguished between creation, providence, miracles, different kinds of creation. Help me understand the differences.
Yes, this is a traditional distinction that theologians have made with respect to God's relations to reality outside of God. On the one hand, creation, properly speaking, is, as I've defined it, bringing things into being from nothing. God is the efficient cause of everything that exists. That is to say, he produced it, he brought it into existence. But he's not the material cause. He's not the stuff out of which things are made. God not only created the things, he created the stuff out of which they're made. Space and time and matter and energy, all of these owe their being to God, and he brought them into being at some point in the finite past. Now, in addition to that initial act of creation, theologians have typically talked about God's conservation of the world in being. That is to say,
keeping it going.
Yes, that he preserves them in being. And were he to withdraw his conserving power, the world would be annihilated. It would vanish in the blink of an eye.
Now, that's not doesn't sound necessarily true. I mean, you could be a creator in having something created and not needed to continue with it.
Well, I guess the whole discussion is whether or not, given God's initial creation of things, things have any sort of ability to
exist
endure
on their
in
own.
Being on their own. Typically, in Christian theology at least, it's been argued that things are radically contingent in their existence and that therefore need to be preserved in being. So the opposite, the polar opposite of creation, is annihilation. And God could create things by bringing them into being, and he could annihilate them by simply withdrawing his sustaining, conserving power, and they would vanish into non-being.
The distinction being that for God to annihilate what he created, he has to withdraw his preserving action as opposed to making an affirmative decision to annihilate.
Yes, that's right. The act of annihilating an object isn't like dynamiting it or something of that sort.
Or puffing it away.
It's more of a passive action. It's just ceasing to maintain it.
Is that distinction important?
Yeah. Is it important? You threw me for a loop.
Good, I like to do that. The difference being whether God has to make an affirmative decision to annihilate, which means that the world he created has an independent existence on its own.
Right.
God can annihilate it. Or if God just withdraws his active sustenance of the world.
I think that by thinking of annihilation as the withdrawal of God's sustaining power, rather than as an active act of destruction, it underlines the contingency of the world upon God in a way that exalts God's power and majesty. Whereas if the world has some sort of positive inertia in being on its own that would require God to blast it out of existence, that would tend to make the world less contingent on God, more independent of God, and therefore would perhaps be thought to diminish God's greatness and power. So in that sense, it perhaps highlights an important difference.
But isn't this just a human philosophical intervention, imagination of which way might be better? We don't have any real knowledge of how God is actually doing it.
Well, the question would be, what philosophical analysis is the best? And I think those who would argue in favor of divine conservation would say that God's status as creator and source of all being would require him to maintain things in being, rather than think that these beings have some sort of ability to be sustained in existence on their own.
The concept of God's involvement in the world, this idea of God's providence, how does that relate to God as the creator?
I think that it means that God is involved in everything that happens in the world, and we can distinguish within God's providence or control of the world. That's what providence means. It's God's superintendence of everything that happens in the world. We can distinguish between God's ordinary providence and what we might call his extraordinary providence. His ordinary providence would be his governance of the world through the instrumentality of natural causes and natural laws.
Which God is involved in, though.
Yes.
And sustaining as a primary cause.
Yes, that's right. That's right. It's not as though he's uninvolved, but nevertheless, it's a purely natural sort of activity. And then his extraordinary providence would be God's bringing about events which lie beyond the productive capacity of natural causes. And these we would call miracles.
And you believe in those?
Yes, I think that it's very clear that if you have the concept of a being who is the creator and designer of the universe and who has therefore decided which natural laws govern the world, that they lie within his power, and that therefore such a transcendent being could easily produce events in the natural world which lie beyond the capacity of natural causes.
I think anybody would agree with the following of that logic. However, the argument would be, does that mean there was an imperfection in how God designed the natural law if he has to intervene to change that natural law?
Well, I don't think we should think of miracles as changes in natural laws. Natural laws describe what will happen given that there are no interfering factors.
Fine.
They are idealizations of what will happen under ideal conditions without the intervention of natural or supernatural agents. So a miracle shouldn't be conceived as breaking the natural law. That is, I think, an improper concept of natural law, and it's psychologically prejudicial as well. It connotes a sort of divine rape of Mother Nature, akin to violating a civil law, to say a miracle is a violation of the natural
Well, how do you
laws.
how do you define it?
I would say a miracle is an event that occurs which is beyond the productive capacity of the natural causes at that time and place.
Sounds like you're a good lawyer saying the same thing.
No, it's not, because I'm not saying he breaks the natural laws. The natural laws hold, but God is able to produce events which the natural causes themselves don't have the capacity to bring about. It's beyond their power to bring about, but it's obviously not beyond God's power. And as you say, given that there's a transcendent creator, the odd miracle for that kind of a being would be child's play.
No one doubts the logic of that. Just one wonders why God had to design a system that he has to tinker with it to change the molecular structures here and there. Couldn't it have been a nicer flow if it was designed nicely from the beginning?
Well, I think it's very important to understand the purpose of miracles. Miracles are not meant to be adjustments to the natural world to rectify imperfections. Rather, miracles are meant to be revelatory, in that they are extraordinary events that they serve as signposts that point beyond the natural world to its ground in a supernatural creator. So, for example, when Jesus of Nazareth performed miracles, he presented these as signs of the inbreaking of God's kingdom in his person, so that his miracles were not meant to be adjustments to an imperfectly operating machine. Rather, they were revelatory, they were signs that God's kingdom was breaking into human history at this point.
How come I haven't seen any?
Well, that maybe you haven't been looking in the right places. I do think
I've come to you.
All right, I think that God still is about the business of doing miracles today, but
Just doesn't care about me.
well, no, he cares about you. I mean, this is getting to a very personal level. I do think that God can do miracles today in people's lives. But I also think, and this gets back to this area of ordinary providence, that God can be operative in your life and answer your prayers without having to bring about miracles through his ordinary providence. And the key here is to remember that God, as an omniscient being, would know what any free person would freely do in any set of circumstances that he created them in. So that God can arrange for things to happen in the world without having to intervene miraculously or tinker in it, by simply setting up the circumstances and the agents in advance, so that when the time comes, the relevant events will transpire, perhaps in answer to a prayer or something of that sort, without any kind of miraculous intervention whatsoever. So we don't need to be looking for miracles in order to see God's providential hand in history. He can work through the secondary causes by means of his knowledge of what contingent events would occur in any circumstances he puts people in.
What I find interesting is the concept of God as creator has a multiplicity of different expressions, from the creation of the world from nothing, to the sustenance of it in a normal way, to the intervention or to the setting up of miracles for specific purposes, potentially if one believes in that. So the concept of God as a creator is a very broad and rich one.
It really is. It's more than just bringing things into existence. It's the initial act of creation of the world out of nothing, of all reality exterior to God. It's then the sustaining of the world in being. It's concurring with the actions of secondary agents to produce their effects. It is his ordinary providence through his omniscience of governing the world of creatures to achieve his ultimate ends. And then it is his miraculous operations in the world beyond the natural capacity of spatiotemporal causes to bring about events that would not have happened in the absence of God's special action. So it's a very rich and variegated doctrine.
Sounds like a full-time job to me.
Yes, though for an omnipotent being, it's not something he can't discharge effectively.